Experts scan 1851 class portrait. They zoom in on one girl's face and go silent. The basement of Linwood University's administrative building smelled like old paper and forgotten dreams. Sarah Chin adjusted her glasses and squinted at the computer screen, where dozens of historical photographs waited to be digitally restored. As the newest intern in the university's preservation department, she'd been assigned the tedious task of cleaning up damaged images for the school's upcoming 175th anniversary celebration. Another class portrait, she muttered, opening the next file. The photograph was from 1851, showing 37 young girls in identical dark uniforms, their faces pale and serious against the sepia tones of early photography. The image was severely degraded. Water damage had created ghostly stains across the surface, and age had faded many faces into barely visible shadows. Sarah launched the AI enhancement software, a cutting-edge program the university had recently acquired. As the algorithms began their work, she turned to grab her coffee, expecting the usual gradual improvement she'd seen with other damaged photographs. But when she looked back at the screen, her cup slipped from her hands and shattered against the concrete floor. The girl in the back row, third from the left, stared back at her with startling clarity. The AI had perfectly reconstructed her face from the damaged pixels, revealing features so sharp and detailed they seemed almost modern. But that wasn't what made Sarah's breath catch in her throat. The girl looked exactly like Margaret Ellis. Sarah had seen the elderly librarian countless times during her months at Linwood. Margaret was a fixture in the university's main library, a quiet woman in her 70s who seemed to know the location of every book and the history of every corner of the campus. Her silver hair was always pulled back in a simple bun, and she wore the same style of wire-rimmed glasses that had probably been fashionable decades ago. But this girl in the photograph, she couldn't be more than 14 or 15, had Margaret's exact bone structure, the same gentle curve of her lips, the identical placement of a small mole just below her left eye. Even the way she held her head, slightly tilted with a distant expression, was purely Margaret. "That's impossible," Sarah whispered, leaning closer to the screen. She zoomed in on the girl's face, her heart racing. The resemblance wasn't just striking, it was perfect. As if someone had taken a photograph of Margaret Ellis as a teenager and somehow inserted it into an 1851 class portrait. The preservation lab door creaked open, and Dr. James Lau walked in, carrying a stack of archival boxes. The history professor was leading the anniversary project, and his enthusiasm for historical mysteries was legendary among students. "Sarah, how's the restoration work coming along?" he asked, setting down the boxes. "I brought some additional materials from the archive that might help us identify some of these schools." Sarah turned in her chair, her face pale. "Professor Lyle, you need to see this. Right now." The urgency in her voice made him cross the room quickly. When he saw the enhanced photograph on the screen, his reaction was immediate and startling. The color drained from his face, and he grabbed the edge of the desk to steady himself. "Dear God," he breathed. "That's Margaret Ellis." "But it can't be," Sarah said, her voice shaking. "This photograph is from 1851. That would make her over 200 years old." Dr. Lyle finished, his voice barely above a whisper. "Which is impossible." They stared at the screen in stunned silence. The girl's eyes seemed to look directly at them, as if she knew they were there, as if she had been waiting for this moment to be discovered. "Maybe it's just a coincidence," Sarah suggested weakly. "Maybe Margaret just has one of those faces, you know? Like how some people look like celebrities." But even as she said it, she knew it wasn't true. This wasn't a resemblance. This was identity. Everything about the girl was Margaret, down to the smallest detail. Dr. Lyle pulled out his phone and began scrolling through his contacts. "I'm calling Margaret. She needs to see this immediately." "Wait," Sarah said, grabbing his arm. "What if we're wrong? What if we're seeing something that isn't there? We should be careful about how we approach this." Dr. Lau looked at her with the intensity of a man who had just stumbled upon the discovery of a lifetime. "Sarah, I've been studying historical photographs for over 30 years. I've never seen anything like this. The facial recognition software we use for identifying people in old photographs, it would flag this as a 100% match. He dialed Margaret's number, his hands trembling slightly. The phone rang 3 times before her familiar, gentle voice answered. Margaret, it's James Lyle from the History Department. I need you to come to the preservation lab immediately. We've found something in one of the anniversary photographs that, well, I can't explain it over the phone. Can you come down here right now? There was a pause on the other end of the line. When Margaret spoke again, her voice carried a note of concern that neither of them had ever heard before. James, is everything all right? You sound upset. I'm fine, Margaret. But I need you to see this photograph. It's important. Very important. I'll be right there, she said, and the line went dead. Sarah and Dr. Lyle sat in tense silence, staring at the enhanced image. The girl's face seemed to glow on the screen, her eyes holding secrets that spanned centuries. Professor, Sarah said quietly, what if this isn't just a coincidence? What if there's something we don't understand about Margaret Ellis? Dr. Lyle didn't answer immediately. He was thinking about all the times he'd spoken with Margaret over the years, all the conversations about history and archives. She always seemed to know things that weren't in the official records, had insights about the past that went beyond academic knowledge. I've always thought there was something different about Margaret, he admitted. Something timeless. As if she carried history with her instead of just studying it. 20 minutes later, Margaret Ellis knocked softly on the lab door. When she entered, she looked exactly as she always did, calm, composed, with that gentle smile that had comforted countless students over the years. But when her eyes fell on the computer screen, everything changed. Her face went white, and she gripped the doorframe for support. The smile disappeared, replaced by an expression of shock and something else, something that looked almost like recognition. Where did you find this? She whispered, her voice barely audible. It's from a collection of photographs from schools that later merged with Linwood, Dr. Lyle explained, watching her carefully. The school was called Marwick Academy. It closed in 1852. Margaret stepped closer to the screen, her hand trembling as she reached out to touch the image. I know that uniform, she said, her voice distant and strange. I remember that uniform. Sarah and Dr. Lyle exchanged glances. Margaret's reaction wasn't surprise at the resemblance. It was something deeper, more profound. Margaret, Dr. Lyle said gently. Do you know who this girl is? Margaret Ellis looked at the photograph for a long moment, her eyes filling with tears. When she finally spoke, her words sent a chill through the room. I think, she said slowly, I think that girl is me. The university's faculty lounge buzzed with whispered conversations over the next few days. Word had spread quickly about the librarian who claimed to be in a 170-year-old photograph. Most colleagues dismissed it as an elderly woman's confusion, but the jokes that followed carried an uncomfortable edge. Maybe Margaret's a time traveler, Dr. Peterson from the English department quipped during lunch. That would explain how she always knows exactly where to find those obscure books nobody else can locate. Or maybe she's a vampire, added Professor Williams from biology, earning nervous laughter from the table. She's certainly been here long enough. But Margaret wasn't laughing. Since seeing the photograph, she'd been experiencing something that felt like memories surfacing from underwater, fragments of scenes that didn't belong to her life, yet felt more real than her actual past. She would be shelving books in the quiet afternoon light, and suddenly smell ink from old-fashioned fountain pens mixed with the acrid scent of gas lanterns. While cataloging historical texts, she'd hear the echo of a woman's voice humming a lullaby she'd never learned but somehow knew every note of. The melody was haunting and unfamiliar, yet it filled her with a deep sense of comfort and longing. 3 days after the discovery, Margaret found herself in Dr. Lyle's office, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had long gone cold. James, I need to tell you something, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I've always felt borrowed. Like my life didn't quite fit me properly. Dr. Lyle leaned forward, his academic curiosity overriding his concern for social boundaries. What do you mean by borrowed? Margaret stared out the window at the campus she'd called home for over 4 decades. My earliest real memory is waking up at Fairhope Orphanage when I was 9 years old. I was lying in a narrow bed with scratchy white sheets, and a nun was sitting beside me, Sister Catherine. She was kind, but when I asked her about my parents, about where I came from, she just said they didn't know. That's not unusual for orphanages, especially in the 1950s, Dr. Lyle said gently. Record keeping wasn't always. But that's just it, Margaret interrupted, her voice growing stronger. I have no memories before that moment. Nothing. Most children, even traumatized ones, have fragments, a toy, a face, a feeling. I had nothing. It was as if my life began at age 9, fully formed but empty. She paused, gathering courage for what she needed to say next. Since seeing that photograph, I've been remembering things that couldn't possibly be my memories. I remember the weight of heavy wool skirts, the sound of steel-nibbed pens scratching against paper, the smell of chalk dust and coal fires. I remember being afraid of something that was coming, something that would change everything. Dr. Lyle had been taking notes, but now he set down his pen and looked at her with growing fascination. Margaret, I need to show you something. I've been researching Marwick Academy since we found the photograph. He pulled out a thick folder and opened it to reveal photocopied documents and newspaper clippings. The school was established in 1847 as an academy for young ladies from prominent families. It was known for its rigorous academic standards and its unusual students. Unusual how? Several newspaper accounts from the time mentioned girls who displayed what they called peculiar knowledge, students who would speak of things that hadn't been invented yet, who would wake screaming from nightmares about future events. Dr. Lyle's eyes were bright with discovery. The school closed abruptly in 1852 after a fire destroyed the main building. Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. A fire? Yes. And here's the strange part. Most of the school records were destroyed, but I found something in our university's legal archive. A hidden inventory list that somehow survived. He handed her a yellowed document. Look at this. Margaret's hands trembled as she read the handwritten list. Halfway down the page, she saw it. Adeline May Lark, age 14, ward of the Commonwealth, noted for night terrors and unusual prescience. That's impossible, she breathed, but even as she said it, the name felt familiar on her tongue. Adeline. She'd always disliked her given name, Margaret, had always felt like it belonged to someone else. There's more, Dr. Lyle said, his voice excited. I found records showing that after the fire, several students were transferred to different institutions. But some girls. He paused dramatically. Some girls were never accounted for. Margaret looked up from the document, her eyes wide. What are you saying? I'm saying that according to these records, Adeline May Lark was one of the students who disappeared the night of the fire. She was never found, never transferred, never claimed by family. She simply vanished. The room fell silent except for the ticking of the old clock on Dr. Lyle's desk. Margaret felt something shifting inside her, like puzzle pieces clicking into place after decades of being scattered. James, she said slowly, I've been afraid of fires my entire life. I can't light a candle, can't sit near a fireplace. I've never understood why. Dr. Lyle leaned back in his chair, his expression a mixture of excitement and disbelief. Margaret, I think we're looking at something extraordinary here. Something that challenges everything we think we know about time, memory, and identity. Margaret stood up, her decision made. Then we need to find out more. I need to go back to the house, the one Sister Catherine left me when she died. I've never properly gone through all of her things. What do you hope to find? Margaret looked at the photograph of Adeline May Lark one more time, seeing her own eyes staring back across the centuries. Answers, she said simply. I need to find out who I really am. The Victorian house on Maple Street had been Margaret's home for over 20 years, but she never felt comfortable in its upper floors. Sister Catherine had left it to her in 1982, along with a simple note. For Margaret, who deserves a place to call her own. The nun had been the closest thing to family Margaret had ever known, yet even she had been mysteriously evasive about Margaret's origins. Now, climbing the narrow stairs to the third floor, Margaret felt her heart racing with each step. The attic had always made her uneasy. Something about the shadows and the way the floorboards creaked seemed to whisper of secrets long buried. The afternoon light filtered through a single dusty window, casting long shadows across boxes and furniture draped in white sheets. Margaret had been up here only a handful of times in 2 decades, each visit cut short by an overwhelming sense of dread she couldn't explain. But today was different. Today, she was searching for answers. She moved carefully through the cluttered space, her eyes adjusting to the dim light. Most of the furniture was clearly from Sister Catherine's time: a rocking chair, a small writing desk, several trunks filled with religious texts and personal items. But in the far corner, partially hidden behind a stack of boxes, stood an ornate wardrobe that seemed much older than everything else. Margaret approached it slowly, her hands trembling as she touched the dark wood. The wardrobe was beautiful, carved with intricate designs of roses and vines, but something about it filled her with inexplicable fear. She noticed it before but had always avoided it, telling herself it was just another piece of Sister Catherine's furniture. The wardrobe doors were locked, but the key hung from a small hook on the side. As Margaret turned it, the mechanism clicked with a sound that sent shivers down her spine. The doors swung open, revealing hanging clothes that smelled of lavender and thyme. She pushed aside the garments, simple dresses and coats that had belonged to Sister Catherine, and ran her hands along the back wall. Her fingers found something unusual, a small section of the wood panel that seemed loose. When she pressed it, there was a soft click, and a hidden compartment opened. Inside was a leather bundle, tied with a faded ribbon. Margaret's hands shook as she lifted it out. The leather was soft with age, and pinned to it was a small piece of paper with 2 letters written in faded ink. A.M. Her heart stopped. Adeline May. Margaret carried the bundle to the window, where the afternoon light was strongest. With trembling fingers, she untied the ribbon and opened the leather wrapping. Inside were 3 items that made her gasp: a child's silver hairbrush, tarnished with age but still beautiful, a small school pin with an engraved M for Marwick Academy, and a stack of brittle letters tied with another ribbon. The hairbrush felt familiar in her hands, as if she'd held it countless times before. The weight of it, the pattern of roses etched into the silver handle, everything about it sparked fragments of memory that felt more real than her conscious thoughts. With shaking hands, she untied the letters and read the first one. It was dated September 15, 1851, and addressed to Miss Adeline May Lark, Marwick Academy for Young Ladies. My dearest Adeline, I hope this letter finds you well, though Mrs. Thornton's reports continue to concern me. She writes that you have been experiencing the night terrors again, and that you speak of things that have not yet come to pass. Yesterday, she tells me, you described great carriages that move without horses, and towers of glass that reach toward the heavens. The other girls are frightened by your visions, dear child. You must try to keep these thoughts to yourself, for your own safety and theirs. With deepest affection and Constance. Margaret's hands were shaking so violently she could barely hold the letter. The words seemed to unlock something deep in her memory, images of herself as a young girl, sitting in a dormitory bed, trying to explain to her roommates about electric lights and automobiles and airplanes. She remembered their frightened faces, remembered being sent to the headmistress's office again and again. She opened the second letter, dated October 3, 1851. Dearest Adeline, Mrs. Thornton is quite beside herself. She says you have been sleepwalking again, and that last night you were found in the courtyard, speaking to someone who was not there. You told her you were talking to a woman with silver hair who wore spectacles and worked in a great library filled with more books than exist in all the world. The physician Dr. Hartwell has examined you and believes your condition is worsening. He speaks of hysteria and recommends treatments that frighten me. Please, dear child, try to behave normally. I fear for your safety if these episodes continue. Your devoted Aunt Constance. Margaret dropped the letter, her mind reeling. She remembered the sleepwalking, remembered the dreams of a library that felt more real than her dormitory room. She remembered talking to a woman with silver hair who seemed so familiar, so comforting, a woman who looked exactly like Margaret herself as an elderly person. With trembling hands, she opened the final letter. It was dated November 28, 1851, and the handwriting was hurried, almost frantic. Adeline, I am coming to collect you immediately. Mrs. Thornton has written that your condition has become dangerous, not just to yourself, but to others. Last night, she says, you predicted the fire that would consume the academy. You spoke of it in such detail that she has ordered all the girls to be evacuated. But most disturbing of all, you told her that when the fire comes, you will not be there to burn. You said you will step through the mirror that ripples like water, and find yourself in a place where you belong. Dr. Hartwell believes you are having prophetic visions, but I fear something far more troubling. You are not becoming ill, dear child. You are waking up too fast. The boundary between who you are and who you will become is dissolving. We must take you somewhere safe, somewhere you can be watched carefully. Sister Catherine at Fairhope has agreed to help us, though she does not fully understand what she is agreeing to. Hold fast, my dear. Help is coming. Constance. Margaret sank to her knees among the dust and shadows, the letters scattered around her. Everything was becoming clear now, terrifyingly, impossibly clear. She wasn't just remembering being Adeline Maylark. She was remembering being taken from Marwick Academy before the fire, remembering the strange journey that had brought her to Fairhope Orphanage, remembering the woman who had helped her cross between two different times. Sister Catherine hadn't found her at the orphanage gate. Sister Catherine had helped her arrive there. And tomorrow, she knew with absolute certainty, she would remember exactly how. Dr. Lyle's office had become a makeshift command center for their investigation. Books about temporal anomalies, psychological displacement, and 19th-century educational institutions covered every surface. When Margaret arrived the next morning, carrying the leather bundle from the attic, she found him hunched over a collection of archival photographs, his hair disheveled and his eyes red from lack of sleep. "Margaret, thank God you're here," he said, looking up with excitement. "I've been researching all night, and I found something extraordinary." He spread out a large photograph on his desk, a stark black and white image of charred ruins against a winter sky. "This is Marwick Academy after the fire. December 2nd, 1851. But look at this." He handed her a magnifying glass and pointed to a section of the photograph. The fire was catastrophic. The entire main building was destroyed, along with the dormitories and the chapel. But here's what's puzzling. According to the official records, no students died in the fire. Margaret studied the photograph through the magnifying glass. The devastation was complete. Nothing remained but blackened stone foundations and twisted metal. How is that possible? If the fire was this severe? That's exactly what I wondered, Dr. Lyle said, pulling out a leather-bound journal. So I kept digging in the archive, and I found this, the personal journal of Headmaster William Thornton. He wrote about the fire, and his account is disturbing. He opened the journal to a bookmarked page and read aloud. The fire came exactly as the Lark child predicted. 3 days she had been speaking of it, describing the flames that would consume the east wing first, then spread to the dormitories. We evacuated the girls based on her prophecy, though I confess I did not believe her until the smoke began to rise. Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. "I remember," she whispered. "I remember seeing the fire before it happened. I could smell the smoke for days before the first flame appeared." Dr. Lyle nodded grimly and continued reading. "But the most disturbing entry is this one, dated December 3rd, the day after the fire. Of our 43 students, 42 have been accounted for. All are safe, thanks to young Adeline's warning. But the child herself was not found in the dormitories during the evacuation. The other girls say she was in her bed when the alarm sounded, but when we searched her room, she was gone." "Gone how?" Margaret asked, though she was beginning to understand. "The headmaster writes, Mrs. Pemberton, the baker's wife, claims she saw the child in the woods that night as the academy burned. But her account is unsettling. She says the girl did not run into the forest as one might expect. Instead, she appeared to step into what Mrs. Pemberton described as a shimmering curtain of air, and then vanished entirely. Mrs. Pemberton is known for her reliable character, but this tale strains credibility. Margaret sank into a chair, her mind reeling. "The mirror that ripples like water," she murmured. "That's what Aunt Constance wrote about in the last letter. I told Mrs. Thornton I would step through a mirror that ripples like water." Dr. Lau closed the journal and looked at her intently. "Margaret, I found something else. Something that might explain how you ended up at Fairhope Orphanage." He pulled out a folder marked "Confidential" and opened it to reveal a collection of documents. "I contacted the diocese that oversaw Fairhope. They still have records from 1958. He handed her a yellowed form titled Child Intake Report. At the top, in careful script, was written, "Margaret Ellis, approximately 9 years of age, found at orphanage gate on morning of June 15, 1958. No identification, no family contacts. Child appears to be in good health but exhibits signs of severe memory loss. But here's the truly remarkable part," Dr. Lau continued, his voice dropping to a whisper. "The report is signed by Sister Catherine Marie Thornton." Margaret's blood ran cold. Thornton. The same name as the headmaster's family? Mrs. Thornton, the headmaster's wife, had a younger sister named Catherine who became a nun. After the fire at Marwick Academy, she left the area and eventually ended up running Fairhope Orphanage. Dr. Lyle's eyes were bright with discovery. "Margaret, I think Sister Catherine knew exactly who you were when you arrived at that orphanage. She'd been waiting for you." Margaret felt the room spinning around her. Memories were surfacing now, not the fragmented flashes she'd been experiencing, but clear, vivid recollections. She remembered the night of the fire, remembered standing in the dormitory as smoke filled the corridors. She remembered the other girls running, screaming, but she had felt a strange calm. "I remember now," she said, her voice distant. "I walked outside while the academy burned, and I saw something. A doorway made of light and shadow. I wasn't afraid. I knew I had to step through it. And when you did?" Margaret closed her eyes, letting the memory wash over her. "I felt like I was falling through water, through time itself. I could see images flashing past me, inventions, cities growing and changing. I saw the world as it would become. And then I was standing at the gates of Fairhope Orphanage, and Sister Catherine was there, as if she'd been waiting for me. She was waiting for you," Dr. Lau said softly. "She knew you were coming because her sister-in-law had told her about the strange girl who could see the future. She knew that somehow, someway, you would find your way to safety." Margaret opened her eyes, and for the first time in her life, she felt truly at peace. "I didn't die in that fire, James. I didn't disappear. I was displaced, moved through time to where I belong." "But why?" Dr. Lyle asked. "Why did it happen to you?" Margaret smiled, understanding finally dawning. "Because I was never meant to live in 1851. I was born in the wrong time, with knowledge and memories that belonged to a different era. The displacement didn't take me away from my life, it brought me home." She looked at the photograph of the ruined academy one more time, then at the intake report from Fairhope Orphanage. "I need to tell you something else, James. Something about why I've always been able to find any book in the library, why I know things about the university's history that aren't in any official records." "What is it?" "I think this isn't the first time I've crossed between different moments in time. I think I've been moving through the years, collecting memories and knowledge, preparing for something. And I think that something is now, this moment, this discovery. I think I've been waiting my whole life to remember who I really am." Dr. Lyle stared at her in wonder. "Margaret, what are you saying?" "I'm saying that my story isn't ending, James. It's just beginning." The university's forgotten archive was located 3 floors beneath the main library, in a section most faculty members didn't even know existed. Dr. Lyle had gained access through his research credentials, but as he and Margaret descended the narrow stairs into the basement's depths, He wondered if they were crossing into territory that was meant to remain undisturbed. "I've been thinking about what you said," he told Margaret as they walked through corridors lined with filing cabinets that stretched back decades. "About this not being the first time you've moved through different moments in time. I think you might be right, and I think I can prove it." Margaret followed him deeper into the archive, her footsteps echoing in the narrow hallway. Since recovering her memories of the crossing, she'd been experiencing a strange sense of anticipation, as if everything in her life had been leading to this moment. "Here," Dr. Lyle said, stopping at a section marked "Legal Documents Deceased Estates 1950 to 1970. He pulled out a thick folder labeled Ellis, Margaret Foster Care Documentation, and spread its contents across a nearby table. "I requested these documents yesterday, and what I found is extraordinary." He handed her the first document, a legal form dated July 3, 1958. "This is your official placement record at Fairhope Orphanage. But look at the details." Margaret studied the form, her hands trembling slightly. Under Child's Background Information, someone had written in careful script, "Subject appeared at facility gates on morning of June 15, 1958. No identification or personal effects. Child exhibits advanced reading ability and unusual knowledge of historical events. Medical examination shows no signs of malnutrition or abuse, suggesting recent care by responsible parties. Child claims no memory of family or previous residence. Advanced reading ability." Margaret murmured, "I remember now, I could read Latin when I arrived at Fairhope. Sister Catherine thought it was remarkable for a 9-year-old. "That's not all," Dr. Lyle said, pulling out another document. "Look at this medical report from Dr. Harrison, the physician who examined you in 1958. The report was typed on letterhead from St. Mary's Hospital. Subject presents as healthy 9-year-old female, approximately 48 inches tall, weight 62 pounds. Notably, child possesses knowledge of medical terminology and procedures beyond expected developmental level. When asked about vaccination history, child described inoculation processes not yet in common use. Child also demonstrated familiarity with dental practices and hygiene methods suggesting exposure to advanced medical care." Margaret felt her breath catch. "I knew things that hadn't been invented yet, just like when I was Adeline." "Exactly. But here's the most astonishing discovery." Dr. Lyle opened another folder, this one marked University Personnel Records Historical. From it, he pulled out a photograph that made Margaret gasp. It was a faculty photograph from Linwood University, dated 1965. In the back row, barely visible among the professors and staff, stood a young woman with dark hair pulled back in a simple bun. She wore wire-rimmed glasses and had the same gentle expression that Margaret carried now. "That's you," Dr. Lyle said softly. "You started working in the university library in 1963, when you were 14 years old. Sister Catherine arranged it as part of your education. But Margaret, look at this." He pointed to the nameplate beneath the photograph. "Miss M. Ellis, Jr., Librarian." "I've been here all along," Margaret whispered. "I've been at this university for over 60 years. Which means," Dr. Lyle continued, his voice filled with wonder, "you were here when the preservation project began. You've been waiting for us to find that photograph of Adeline May Lark." Margaret sank into a nearby chair, overwhelmed by the implications. "I guided you to it, didn't I? All those times I suggested which archives to explore, which collections might be interesting for the anniversary project. I was leading you to the discovery." Dr. Lyle nodded. "I think you've been preparing for this moment your entire life. Every book you've catalogued, every historical document you've preserved, every student you've helped with research, you've been building toward this revelation." He pulled out one final document, a legal form she'd never seen before. "This is the most remarkable piece of evidence. It's your legal name change form, filed just after you turned 18 in 1967. Margaret read the document with growing amazement. "I changed my name from Margaret Ellis to Margaret Adeline Ellis." She looked up at Dr. Lyle with tears in her eyes. "I was trying to remember even then. I was trying to reconnect with who I really was. Margaret, Dr. Lyle said gently, I think you've been living in a state of temporal suspension, existing between your past as Adeline and your present as Margaret. The photograph was the key that unlocked your full memory. Margaret stood up and walked to the small window that looked out onto the university campus. Students were walking between classes, carrying books and chatting about their studies, completely unaware that they were passing by a woman who had literally traveled through time. I understand now, she said, her voice calm and certain. I wasn't displaced accidentally. I was sent here, to this time, this place, for a purpose. I was meant to preserve the history, to be the bridge between past and future. She turned back to Dr. Lyle, her eyes bright with understanding. Every historical document I've saved, every archive I've organized, every piece of the university's past that I've protected, I've been doing it because I remember when these things were the present. I remember the people who created them, the stories behind them. So what happens now? Dr. Lyle asked. Margaret smiled, and for the first time in her life, she felt completely whole. Now I stop hiding from who I am. I've spent 60 years living between identities, afraid to fully remember because the truth seemed impossible. But it's not impossible, it's my reality. She picked up the photograph from 1965, studying her younger face. I'm going to visit the portrait exhibit again, James. I'm going to stand in front of that 1851 photograph and remember everything, not as scattered fragments, but as a complete story. And then I'm going to tell the world about the girl who stepped through time to find her true home. Margaret's voice was filled with quiet determination. I'm going to reclaim both of my identities and live as the whole person I was always meant to be. As they gathered the documents to leave the archive, Margaret felt a profound sense of completion. She wasn't just Margaret Ellis, the elderly librarian, or Adeline May Lark, the displaced student. She was both, and more. She was living proof that time wasn't the straight line everyone believed it to be. She was ready to embrace her extraordinary truth. 6 months later, the university's portrait exhibit had become the most visited display in Linwood's history. Tourists, scholars, and curious locals came daily to see the impossible sight, a 1851 class photograph hanging beside a contemporary portrait of an elderly woman who appeared to be the same person, separated by over a century and a half. Margaret stood in the exhibit hall, watching a group of graduate students debate the implications of her story. She wore a simple blue dress and the same wire-rimmed glasses she'd worn for decades, but now she carried herself with a quiet confidence that hadn't been there before. The facial bone structure is identical, one student was saying, pointing between the two photographs. Even accounting for aging, this level of similarity is statistically impossible unless they're the same person. But that would mean she's lived for over 200 years, another student protested. It's physically impossible. Margaret smiled and approached the group. Not impossible, she said gently. Just extraordinary. The students turned to her with recognition and awe. Over the past months, Margaret had become something of a celebrity, though she handled the attention with the same grace she'd brought to her decades as a librarian. Ms. Lark Ellis, one of the students said respectfully, using the name she'd legally adopted 3 months earlier. Do you really remember being in that 1851 photograph? I remember everything, Margaret replied, her voice filled with quiet certainty. I remember the morning it was taken, October 15, 1851. I remember how the photographer's flash powder made us all cough, and how my collar was too tight because it was a new uniform. She moved closer to the 1851 photograph, her eyes finding her younger self in the back row. I remember being afraid that day, knowing something terrible was coming. The fire was still weeks away, but I could already smell the smoke in my dreams. Dr. Lyle joined them, carrying a small stack of books. Margaret has just finished her memoir, he announced to the students. It will be published next month by the university press. Margaret held up a slim volume titled, The Girl in the Frame, A Journey Through Time and Memory. The cover featured both photographs, the 1851 class portrait and her contemporary image, side by side. I didn't write it to convince anyone of anything, Margaret explained. I wrote it to share what I've learned about identity, memory, and the ways our past and present can intertwine in unexpected ways. One of the graduate students raised her hand hesitantly. Ms. Lark Ellis, what's it like to remember living in two different centuries? Margaret considered the question carefully. It's like having two different sets of memories that both feel equally real because they are equally real. I remember gas lamps and carriages, but I also remember the first time I saw electric lights and automobiles. I remember when the telephone was a marvel, and I remember when computers arrived at the library. She paused, looking out the window at the modern campus. But mostly, I remember feeling like I was searching for something my entire life, and finally understanding what it was, myself. My complete self. Dr. Lyle stepped forward, his face glowing with pride. Margaret has agreed to stay on as a special lecturer in our history department. She'll be teaching courses on archival preservation and historical research methods. And giving tours of the exhibit? One student asked hopefully. Every Tuesday and Thursday, Margaret confirmed with a warm smile. I find that sharing the story helps people think differently about time, memory, and what we consider possible. As the students dispersed, Margaret and Dr. Lyle stood alone before the exhibit. The afternoon light streamed through the tall windows, illuminating both photographs in a golden glow. Any regrets? Dr. Lyle asked softly. Margaret shook her head. How can I regret a journey that brought me home? I spent 60 years feeling incomplete, and now I understand why. I wasn't just Margaret Ellis, the quiet librarian with gaps in her memory. I was Adeline May Lark, displaced through time, carrying the experiences of two different eras. She touched the glass that protected the 1851 photograph. That girl in the picture, she was so afraid of what was coming. If I could speak to her now, I'd tell her that the crossing through time wouldn't take her away from her life. It would lead her to exactly where she belonged. And where is that? Dr. Lyle asked. Margaret gestured around the exhibit hall, where her story was displayed for all to see. Here. In this place where past and present meet, where stories are preserved and shared. I've spent my entire life, both lives, preparing for this moment, when I could finally tell the complete truth about who I am. A young woman entered the exhibit hall, approaching the photographs with the same wonder Margaret had seen in countless visitors. As the woman read the placard explaining Margaret's story, her face filled with amazement. Excuse me, the woman said, turning to Margaret. Are you really the person in both of these photographs? Margaret nodded, her eyes twinkling with gentle humor. I'm Adeline Margaret Lark Ellis, and this is my story. But how is it possible? Margaret smiled, the same quiet smile that had graced her face in 1851 and continued to grace it now. Sometimes the impossible is just the truth waiting to be understood. As the woman walked away, shaking her head in wonder, Margaret felt a deep sense of peace. Her life had never been ordinary, but now, finally, it was whole. She had reclaimed not just her identity, but her purpose, to serve as a bridge between past and future, a living reminder that time held mysteries beyond human understanding. The girl in the frame had found her way home at last.